Are you ready to hear the call that could change everything? This is not just another message, it's a divine summons, a heavenly trumpet sounding urgently over your life right now. God is speaking with holy intensity, calling you to wake up and listen. The words you're about to hear are filled with eternal significance, carrying the weight of a powerful message that is meant for you. This is not a suggestion or a mere comfort wrapped in poetic words. This is a life-altering call to action. Don't let distractions pull you away or allow your mind to wander. God is speaking to you in this moment, and ignoring this message could mean missing out on something far greater than you can imagine. Stay focused, stay close, and lean in, because this message has the power to ignite your soul and change your life forever. Don't let this moment pass by without responding. In the quiet of the early morning, a young man named Elijah sat in the dim light of his room, wrestling with his thoughts. Life had become a whirlwind of distractions, pulling him in every direction. He had grown accustomed to the noise of the world, the constant pull of temptation and duty that left him feeling fragmented. But deep within, he knew something was missing. His heart longed for something greater, something deeper. He had once walked closely with God, but over time, the distractions of life had worn him down. He had allowed the busyness of the world to crowd out his connection with the divine. One night, as Elijah sat by his window, staring at the stars, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. A voice that carried the weight of eternity, calling him to rise above the noise. "Elijah, my child," the voice whispered, "you've been living in half-truths, serving with half-hearted devotion. You cannot walk this path with a divided heart. I need all of you." Elijah felt a rush of conviction. His heart pounded as the realization hit him. God wasn't asking for a fraction of his life. He was calling for his entire being. Every ounce of his energy, every decision, every moment, God wanted full obedience, complete surrender, no more distractions, no more compromises. It was time for him to return to the place of true devotion. As the days passed, Elijah struggled with the decision. The world was still loud, still demanding his attention. His friends, his work, his ambitions, they all pulled at him, trying to keep him in their grip. But deep down, he knew that he couldn't move forward until he made a choice. The distractions had to go. He had to choose to focus on what mattered most: his relationship with God. One morning, as Elijah knelt in prayer, he heard the voice again. "You must consecrate yourself, Elijah. Set yourself apart. There is no room for half-heartedness in my kingdom. I want all of you. Your heart, your mind, your soul, devote them to me fully. Your service to me cannot be lukewarm. You cannot serve both me and the distractions of this world. Choose today whom you will serve." The words pierced his soul. Elijah knew that the path before him would not be easy. It would require sacrifice, discipline, and a complete shift in how he lived. But he also knew that the reward would be worth it. There was a peace, a joy, a fulfillment that came only from complete devotion to God. It was the only way to find true contentment, the only way to walk in the fullness of his plans for his life. He began to make small but powerful changes. He eliminated the distractions that had once dominated his time. He stopped chasing after fleeting pleasures and instead began to seek God's will in every area of his life. The process wasn't instantaneous, and there were moments when he stumbled, but with each step, Elijah grew stronger in his commitment. The more he focused on God, the more he realized how much he had been missing. The peace he had longed for began to flood his heart, and his purpose became clearer than ever before. God's voice, once a whisper, now resonated within him with clarity and purpose. "When you focus on me, Elijah," God spoke, "you will begin to see the world through my eyes. Your path will be illuminated, and I will lead you in ways you never imagined. But you must make the choice to follow me wholeheartedly. I will not share my glory with the distractions of this world." As Elijah continued on his journey of consecration, he found that the more he surrendered, the more he received. God's wisdom and strength filled him, and the distractions that once seemed so important began to fade away. He was no longer divided. His heart and mind were focused on the one true purpose. And in that focus, Elijah discovered a peace that surpassed all understanding. In the quiet of his devotion, Elijah realized that the path God had called him to was not one of sacrifice, but of deep fulfillment. As he let go of the distractions and gave his whole heart to God, he found the life he had been searching for all along, a life of purpose, peace, and divine alignment. The journey was just beginning, but Elijah knew that with God at the center, nothing could pull him off course. There was a man named Jacob who had once been full of dreams and passion. He had a heart that burned with ambition, eager to make a difference in the world and serve others. He had built his life on the belief that he could accomplish great things, but over time, the harsh realities of life began to take a toll on him. His dreams, once vibrant, now seemed distant. The weight of failure and disappointment left him feeling empty, and the fire that had once burned so brightly within him had dimmed. Jacob's life became a series of small victories and painful losses. He had been through relationships that shattered his trust, jobs that drained his spirit, and personal struggles that left him wondering if his dreams had been nothing more than illusions. The fire that had once fueled him seemed to have been extinguished, and all he could see was the ashes of what he had hoped for. He had no strength left to try again, and the thought of starting over seemed impossible. One evening, as Jacob sat by the window staring out at the fading sunset, he felt a presence that he had not felt in a long time. It wasn't a loud voice, but it was as if something deep within his soul had stirred. In the quiet of that moment, he heard a whisper, gentle yet powerful. "Jacob, I have not forgotten you. I am bringing your dreams back to life. What you thought was lost will be restored." The words echoed through Jacob's heart like a gentle breeze, but they also carried a weight of promise that he had not felt in years. For the first time in a long while, he dared to hope. He realized that the dryness he had felt, the emptiness that had consumed him, was not the end. It was a season, a chapter in his story that was about to change. God was calling him to rise from the ashes, to believe again, and to step into the revival and restoration that awaited him. As Jacob began to embrace the possibility of new life, he found himself drawn back to the things that once filled his heart with passion. He remembered the joy he had once felt when he helped others, the satisfaction that came from giving back. Slowly, the dry bones of his spirit began to stir. It was not an instant transformation, but a gradual process of healing. God was breathing life back into his dreams, one breath at a time. The first step was simple. Jacob began to believe again. He allowed himself to imagine a future where his dreams could be restored. He saw himself helping others, rebuilding relationships, and finding joy in the work that had once fulfilled him. It wasn't easy, doubt still lingered, but with each day, he felt a little stronger. Each small step he took toward restoration was like a spark reigniting the flame of his purpose. As time passed, Jacob began to see the changes in his life. The relationships that had once been fractured began to heal, not because of anything he had done, but because God was working behind the scenes. Doors that had been slammed shut slowly began to open again, and opportunities that seemed impossible started to emerge. Jacob realized that God had never abandoned him. He had been waiting for him to believe in the possibility of revival. Jacob's dreams, once thought to be buried under the weight of his failures, began to rise again. He began to take action in small but significant ways. He poured into his relationships, giving love and attention to the people who mattered most. He returned to his work with renewed passion, no longer seeing it as a burden, but as a calling. And as he did, he saw that the restoration he had longed for was happening before his eyes. What had been broken was being mended. What had been lost was being found. One morning, as Jacob sat in his favorite chair with a cup of coffee, he reflected on the journey he had been on. The dry bones of his life had been resurrected, and his dreams, once thought impossible, were now flourishing. He had been brought back to life in ways he could never have imagined. The words he had heard that day so long ago, "I am bringing your dreams back to life," had proven true. Jacob smiled as he realized that the revival he had experienced was not just about restoring his dream set, was about restoring his heart. God had not just breathed life into his hopes, he had breathed life into his very soul. The empty spaces that had once consumed him were now filled with purpose, joy, and love. He was living a life he never thought possible, all because he had dared to believe in the promise of revival and restoration. And so, Jacob continued to walk in the path that God had set before him. He knew that life would not always be easy, but he also knew that no matter how dry the bones of his spirit had seemed, God would always bring new life. There would always be restoration, always be revival, and always be hope for those who dare to trust in his promises. Lena had always felt a deep longing in her heart, a hunger she couldn't quite name. Growing up, she had been taught to believe in God. But as time passed, life's challenges and distractions made it harder for her to feel that connection. The noise of the world, its pressures, its temptations, its endless demands seemed to drown out the quiet whispers of God's voice. She had tried to fill the emptiness with achievements, relationships, and possessions, but nothing seemed to satisfy. Every success felt hollow, every victory short-lived. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Lena found herself alone in her apartment, staring out the window at the vast sky. Her mind was heavy, her heart burdened, and the restlessness inside her grew louder. She had been ignoring something deep within her, something that had been tugging at her for a long time. It was a calling invitation to something greater, something purer, but she had been too afraid to listen, too comfortable in her own plans to let go. That night, as she sat in the stillness of her room, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, a simple cry for peace. "God, what do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. In that moment, she felt a shift. It wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. A sense of clarity washed over her, and the weight on her chest seemed to lift just slightly. It was as if God was gently reminding her of something she had long forgotten, something she had been too busy to acknowledge. The next morning, Lena woke up with a strange sense of urgency. It wasn't like the typical rush to get to work or to check off a to-do list. This was different. It was a quiet whisper urging her to seek more, to stop living on autopilot and start aligning her life with something far more meaningful. She felt a deep stirring within her soul, a desire for something beyond the surface, a desire for purity, for holiness. As the days passed, Lena began to feel the weight of this calling more and more. She began to realize that God wasn't calling her to perfection or to an easy life. He was calling her to consecrate herself, to set apart her heart, her mind, and her actions for his purpose. It was a call to holiness, a call to purify her intentions and desires. And though the idea seemed daunting at first, she felt a peace that came with embracing this divine invitation. She began by letting go of the things that had held her captive for so long, habits that distracted her, relationships that drained her, and thoughts that kept her from experiencing true freedom. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was a process. Slowly, she found herself aligning her heart more with God's will. She spent time in prayer, seeking his guidance, and listening for his voice. She started to realize that the noise around her had always been a distraction, and that true peace could only come when she chose to embrace divine communication rather than dismissing it. Lena's journey wasn't easy, and there were times when the old temptations resurfaced, but with each step forward, she found herself growing stronger in her commitment to purity and holiness. She learned that it wasn't about living a perfect life, it was about living a life fully surrendered to God's will, trusting that he would guide her every step of the way. The more she consecrated herself, the more she felt the joy of being in alignment with her true purpose. One day, as she sat in her quiet space, reflecting on the changes she had experienced, Lena realized how far she had come. The longing she had once felt was now filled with a deep sense of contentment. God had been faithful to guide her through the process of purification, and though the journey had been challenging, it had also been incredibly rewarding. She had learned to listen for his voice, to trust his plan, and to walk in his holiness. Lena's life was no longer defined by the distractions and the noise of the world. She had found a new sense of clarity and peace that came from living a life aligned with God's will. And as she looked back on her journey, she understood that the call to consecration, holiness, and purity wasn't just about following a set of rules set. It was about embracing a relationship with God that transformed her from the inside out. She knew that this was just the beginning, and that with each day, she would continue to grow in her devotion and alignment with his purpose. As she stepped into this new season of her life, Lena felt more connected to the divine than ever before. She had learned that true fulfillment didn't come from worldly success or possessions. It came from living a life of purity and holiness, surrendered completely to God's will. And she knew that no matter what came her way, she would never again ignore the gentle whisper of his call, for it was the voice that led her to a life of peace, purpose, and divine communion. Sarah had always believed in the power of hard work. She grew up with the idea that if she put in the effort, she could overcome any challenge and achieve her dreams. Yet, as she moved into adulthood, life seemed to test that belief. No matter how hard she worked or how much she sacrificed, it felt like the pieces of her life just wouldn't fall into place. There were times when she questioned whether all her efforts were worth it. The silence of unanswered prayers weighed heavily on her heart, and the waiting seemed endless. There were dreams Sarah had carried with her for years. Dreams of a thriving career, a fulfilling relationship, and a sense of peace that had long eluded her. But no matter how much she prayed, how hard she worked, the doors remained closed. It felt as though everything was happening around her, but nothing was happening for her. She saw others moving forward while she was stuck, waiting. Her patience was being tested in ways she had never imagined. The longer she waited, the harder it became to hold on to hope. One night, as Sarah sat in the quiet of her room, feeling the weight of her frustration, a thought struck her. What if this waiting, this silence, is not a sign of failure, but a sign of God working in the background? It was a simple thought, but it resonated deeply with her. She realized that perhaps this was the moment to surrender fully to trust that even when she couldn't see the progress, God was still at work. The next day, Sarah began to embrace the idea that the waiting wasn't just about time passing. She started to see it as a season of growth, one where she could focus on developing strength, patience, and wisdom. She understood that God's timing was far beyond her understanding, and she didn't need to rush through it. It was in this time of waiting that God was preparing her for the future that she couldn't yet see. Slowly, Sarah started to trust that the silence wasn't a void, but a space where God was working deep within her. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Sarah's perspective shifted. She stopped viewing the waiting as a burden and began to see it as an opportunity for transformation. She spent more time in prayer, not asking for things to happen immediately, but asking for the strength to endure and the patience to trust. In the quiet moments, she found herself more attuned to God's voice. She began to realize that the challenges she was facing were not setbacks, but stepping stones leading her to something greater. One evening, Sarah was sitting by the window watching the rain fall softly outside when she had a moment of clarity. She realized that waiting had shaped her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It had taught her endurance the ability to stay the course even when she couldn't see the end in sight. It had built her patience, showing her that not everything needed to be rushed. And most importantly, it had taught her trust. Trust that God was doing something in her life that she couldn't see yet, but that was unfolding perfectly according to His plan. The months of silence had not been in vain. They had been a time of building, a time of strengthening. Sarah understood now that the waiting had made her stronger, wiser, and more capable of handling the blessings that were coming her way. She had learned to rest in God's perfect timing, knowing that He was working behind the scenes, even when she couldn't see it. She had learned that patience wasn't just about sitting still, it was about enduring with faith, trusting that God was faithful to His promises. One day, as Sarah looked back on her journey, she saw the growth that had taken place in her. The challenges she had faced and the waiting she had endured had shaped her into someone more resilient, more grounded in her faith, and more prepared for the future. She saw the doors that had once been closed slowly opening, not because of her efforts, but because of God's perfect timing. The blessings that had seemed so far off were now within reach. Sarah smiled, realizing that the waiting had not been a waste. It had been a season of preparation, a time for God to work in her life. She knew now that she didn't need to rush the process. There was a peace that came from trusting God's timing, a peace that was born from the endurance she had built during those quiet, waiting moments. She had learned that even in silence, God was working, and that was enough. James had always felt a deep sense of purpose growing up. His life had been full of promises, full of dreams, and a future he believed was set before him. But as time passed, the reality of his journey felt less like a clear path and more like a maze of disappointments and heartaches. His once vibrant dream seemed to slip away as circumstances shifted beyond his control. He had lost so much relationships, opportunities, and even the passion that once ignited his heart. With each setback, his faith wavered, and he began to wonder if the promises he once held so tightly to were nothing more than illusions. There were times when James felt as though he was standing on the edge, staring at the pieces of his life scattered before him, unsure of how to put Every effort to rebuild was met with more disappointment, and the weight of his failures grew heavier. His heart, once filled with hope, now seemed to carry the scars of the past. He longed for restoration, for a sense of peace that would make him feel whole again. But no matter how much he prayed, no matter how much he tried, nothing seemed to change. One evening, as James sat in his quiet room, wrestling with his thoughts, a sense of stillness washed over him. In the silence, a thought lingered, a whisper from deep within his heart that he hadn't heard in a long time. What seems lost will be restored. I have not forgotten you. He didn't know where the thought had come from, but it felt like a lifeline, like a promise that had been waiting for him to grasp it. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for him after all. The next day, James found himself reflecting on the quiet whisper he had heard. It wasn't just a fleeting thought, it was a calling to trust again, to believe in restoration. He realized that in the midst of his pain and disappointment, God had never abandoned him. God's love was unwavering, always present, even in his darkest moments. James knew that the journey to restoration would not be immediate, nor would it be easy, but he felt a renewed sense of faith rising within him. He had to trust that, in time, God would restore what had been broken. As the weeks went by, James made a conscious choice to walk forward in faith. He began to surrender the pain of his past, choosing to let go of the resentment and self-doubt that had held him captive for so long. Each day, he made an effort to trust God's timing, to believe that his plan for him was still in motion, even when he couldn't see the full picture. With each step, James felt a little lighter, a little more at peace. He began to see small signs of restoration, relationships slowly mending, opportunities reappearing, and a sense of purpose beginning to take root once again. But the process of restoration was not a quick fix. There were moments when doubt crept in and the weight of his past threatened to pull him back. Yet, James knew that faith required patience and obedience. It was not a one-time decision, but a daily choice to walk in trust. No matter how uncertain the future seemed. He continued to lean into God's promises, knowing that his love was unwavering and always present, even in the most challenging moments. One evening, as James reflected on the progress he had made, he realized that the restoration he had longed for was unfolding before his eyes, not in the way he had imagined, but in ways that were far more meaningful. The broken pieces of his life were slowly being reassembled, not as they once were, but in a new and beautiful way. His faith, patience, and obedience had led him to a place of fulfillment he had never expected. It wasn't just about restoring his dreams, it was about restoring his heart, his spirit, and his connection with God. James smiled, knowing that he was no longer defined by his past failures. His life was being restored in ways that only God could orchestrate. The love that he had once doubted was now the foundation of his hope. God had never given up on him, and through faith, patience, and obedience, James was seeing the fulfillment of promises that had once seemed lost. He knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but he also knew that with God by his side, nothing was impossible. His heart was filled with gratitude for the restoration that had taken place, and he trusted that God's love would continue to lead him on a path of fulfillment, joy, and purpose. What seemed lost had been found again, and James was ready to walk boldly into the future, knowing that God's love would never fail him. Maya had always believed that the path to success would be straightforward. She had dreams, ambitions, and a heart full of hope. But life, as it often does, threw a series of challenges her way. At first, there were small obstacles, disappointments, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But soon, the weight of the challenges seemed overwhelming, and Maya found herself standing at the crossroads of uncertainty, unsure of which direction to take. The first major challenge came when she lost her job. It wasn't just the loss of income that hurt, but the sudden blow to her confidence. Maya had worked hard for years to build a career, and in an instant, it felt like everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. She spent days in a haze of frustration and self-pity, unable to shake the feeling of defeat. The questions in her mind were relentless. Why did this happen to me? What did I do wrong? But as the days turned into weeks, Maya began to reflect on her life, on the dreams she had once held so dearly. It was in the silence of her soul searching that she felt a whisper, gentle reminder that this moment, though painful, was not the end. It was a challenge, yes, but it was also an opportunity. An opportunity to grow, to learn, and to rely on something greater than herself. It was an opportunity to trust in God's plan, even when it didn't make sense. One evening, as Maya sat by the window, watching the rain pour outside, she felt the weight of her fears and doubts starting to lift. She realized that the obstacles she faced weren't roadblocks but stepping stones. Life's challenges, while difficult, were there to shape her, to refine her, and to help her become the person she was meant to be. She had spent so much time focusing on the fear of failure that she had forgotten the power of growth through adversity. With renewed clarity, Maya made the decision to shift her perspective. She stopped seeing her challenges as punishments and started seeing them as invitations for transformation. Each setback, each obstacle, was a chance to strengthen her faith and character. She remembered the words her grandmother had shared with her as a child. The storm doesn't last forever, but the strength you gain from it will. As Maya embraced this new outlook, the challenges she faced began to feel less like burdens and more like opportunities to rise. She began to trust that God's love was stronger than any fear or obstacle. She no longer allowed the uncertainty of the future to paralyze her. Instead, she faced each day with courage, knowing that no matter what came her way, she was not alone. Maya's journey wasn't without its moments of doubt. There were times when she stumbled, times when the weight of her challenges felt too heavy to bear. But in those moments, she leaned on her faith, trusting that God's love would carry her through. She found strength in the quiet moments of prayer, in the reassurance that she was never abandoned, even when the road seemed difficult. Each time she faced a challenge, she grew stronger, more resilient, and more aware of the incredible power of God's love. As weeks turned into months, Maya saw how much she had changed. The challenges that had once felt like insurmountable obstacles were now stepping stones that had helped her grow. She had learned to trust in the process, to embrace the lessons hidden in the struggles, and to rely on God's timing. Her faith had deepened, her character had strengthened, and she had discovered a resilience within herself that she never knew existed. One day, as Maya looked back on her journey, she realized that the challenges she had faced were not only opportunities for growth, but also signs of God's love at work in her life. Each challenge had brought her closer to her true self, to the person she was always meant to be. And with each obstacle overcome, she had experienced a deeper understanding of God's unwavering love that was stronger than any fear, stronger than any obstacle. Maya smiled, knowing that her journey was far from over. She had learned that life's challenges were not to be feared, but embraced. With faith, patience, and trust in God's plan, she knew she could overcome anything. The road ahead might not always be easy, but she was no longer afraid. She was ready for whatever came her way, knowing that God's love would always be the strength she needed to rise above every challenge. Eli had always believed that his life had a purpose, though the path to it wasn't clear. He had always felt a pull in his heart, a desire to make a difference, but the way forward often felt uncertain. The transitions in his life came without warning, shifting careers, moving to new places, and even the end of relationships. Each time one chapter closed, he wondered what the next would hold. There were moments when he doubted whether the changes were part of a bigger plan or just random events that left him feeling lost and uncertain. It wasn't until the day he lost his job that the question of purpose truly began to haunt him. Eli had worked diligently in a career he had thought was his calling. But when the job came to an abrupt end, he found himself at a crossroads. The feeling of being adrift overwhelmed him. He questioned his value, his place in the world, and most of all, the purpose of everything he had worked for. What is all this for? He wondered. Is there a bigger plan, or am I just a leaf blowing in the wind? In the quiet of that night, as Eli sat alone in his room, the weight of his uncertainty heavy on his heart, he remembered something his grandmother used to say. When you trust God's timing, you're never lost. Even in the storm, He knows the way. The words resonated deeply with him, though he hadn't fully understood them until that moment. He realized that the storms, the transitions, and the shifts in his life weren't meaningless. They were part of something much larger, something divine. Over the next few weeks, Eli began to spend more time in reflection, praying and seeking clarity. He felt an overwhelming need to pause and listen, to quiet the noise around him, and to seek divine guidance. He remembered that his grandmother had also taught him that God's plan wasn't always easy to see, but it was always full of purpose. He couldn't help but wonder what this new chapter was leading to. The waiting was uncomfortable, but he felt a stillness that encouraged him to trust. He didn't need to have them all at once. One day, while walking through the park, Eli met an older man who seemed to exude peace. The man had a gentle smile and a quiet presence that immediately drew Eli's attention. After a few minutes of small talk, the man shared a simple but profound statement. "Don't worry about your path, my friend. God has already set the course for you. You just need to trust in his direction." The words felt like a balm to Eli's anxious heart. It was as if God was speaking directly to him, reassuring him that even in his confusion, he was guiding him. The next few months were transformative for Eli. He found that as he began to trust in God's plan, opportunities started to align in ways he hadn't expected. He received an unexpected job offer in a completely new field, one that aligned with his passions and values more than the job he had lost. The new role didn't come with all the answers, but it gave him a sense of purpose and a renewed belief in God's timing. Eli realized that each transition in his life had been leading him here to a place where he could truly make a difference. Eli's faith in God's guidance grew stronger with each passing day. He started to understand that divine timing was not about understanding the full picture right away, but about trusting that God knew what was best for him. Even the painful transitions, the loss, the changes, the unknown had been part of the preparation for this moment. He had been guided all along, even when he couldn't see the path clearly. One evening, as Eli sat in his new office, reflecting on how far he had come, he felt a deep sense of peace. He understood now that his life was part of a much bigger plan. Every transition, every shift in direction had been a stepping stone that had led him here. He knew that God's guidance was not always loud or obvious, but it was always present. It was a quiet whisper that led him through the chaos, a steady hand that steadied him when he felt uncertain. Eli smiled, feeling the weight of his past struggles transform into a sense of purpose. The uncertainty he had once felt had given way to trust. He had learned that life's transitions weren't signs of being lost, they were opportunities to grow, to learn, and to align more closely with the divine plan. Eli knew that the journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt confident in the direction he was headed. His faith in God's timing had taught him that no matter where the path led, he was never truly lost. God's guidance had always been with him, and it would continue to lead him toward a future full of purpose and divine fulfillment. Isabella had always been a strong person. She carried herself with grace, never letting the world see her struggles. But behind the smile, there was a weight that she carried alone. Her life had been filled with moments of joy, but also deep sorrow. She had loved deeply and lost painfully. The loss of her mother at a young age, the disappointment of failed relationships, and the struggles in her career had left her feeling broken. There were days when she wondered if she would ever find her way back to the joy she had once known. The sadness seemed to seep into her bones, and no matter how much she tried to move forward, it lingered. For years, Isabella kept her brokenness hidden. She wore her pain like a mask, pretending everything was fine, even when she felt empty inside. She kept busy, distracting herself from the ache in her heart, but no matter how much she worked, or how many things she bought, or how much she tried to please others, she never felt truly fulfilled. The joy she had once felt seemed like a distant memory, something she could never quite grasp again. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Isabella found herself alone in her apartment, staring out the window. The weight of the world seemed unbearable, and she couldn't hold back the tears anymore. She cried out to God, not knowing what to say, but feeling a deep, desperate need to be heard. "God, I don't know if I can keep going," she whispered through her sobs. "I feel so broken. Will I ever be whole again?" In the stillness that followed her prayer, a sense of peace began to wash over her. It wasn't the peace she had expected, a sudden end to her pain, but a quiet knowing that something was shifting inside her. She felt God's presence, not as a solution to her problems, but as a reminder that he was with her, even in her brokenness. A soft voice in her heart whispered, "This is not the end, my child. Your story is still being written. I will turn your sadness into joy and your brokenness into beauty. Trust in the process." Isabella wasn't sure what those words meant, But something deep within her stirred. She had spent so long focusing on what she had lost that she hadn't considered the possibility that her pain could be transformed. Maybe, just maybe, God could take the broken pieces of her life and make something beautiful from them. She didn't know how or when, but she decided to hold on to that hope. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that her story wasn't over. The next morning, Isabella woke up with a new sense of purpose. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she needed to take small steps toward healing. She started by practicing gratitude, finding things each day to thank God for, no matter how small they seemed. She was thankful for the love of her friends, for the roof over her head, for the small victories she had achieved. Slowly, she began to feel a shift within her. Her perspective started to change. The sadness didn't disappear, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. As the weeks went by, Isabella began to see her life through new eyes. She realized that God wasn't asking her to forget her pain or deny the hurt she had experienced. Instead, He was showing her that through faith, perseverance, and gratitude, she could experience transformation. Her brokenness wasn't a curse. It was the very thing that could lead her to deeper healing. Her struggles were not punishments. They were opportunities for growth. She began to see that her scars were not marks of defeat, but symbols of strength. With time, Isabella's heart began to soften. She let go of the bitterness that had taken root over the years. She embraced the process of healing, understanding that it was not a quick fix, but a journey. There were days when the sadness returned, but she no longer saw it as something to be ashamed of. It was part of her story, and God was using it to shape her into the person she was becoming. She learned that transformation didn't happen overnight, but with patience and perseverance, she would emerge stronger, wiser, and more whole than before. One day, as Isabella stood in front of the mirror, she realized something remarkable. The person looking back at her was different. She had been through the fire of pain and sorrow, but she had been refined by it. Her heart had been healed, and her joy had returned, not because everything in her life was perfect, but because she had learned to trust in the process of transformation. She had allowed God to take her brokenness and turn it into something beautiful. She had found beauty in her scars and joy in the midst of her trials. Isabella's life wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but she knew now that each challenge was an opportunity for growth. She no longer feared the pain or the struggles. She knew they were part of the journey. With faith, gratitude, and perseverance, she had discovered the strength to keep going. And as she continued on her path, she trusted that God's love would carry her through, transforming every hardship into a stepping stone toward the person she was meant to be. In that moment, Isabella understood the true meaning of God's promise. I will turn your sadness into joy and your brokenness into beauty. She had seen it happen in her own life, and she knew that God's transformation was far greater than anything she could have imagined. She was no longer defined by her pain. She was defined by the beauty that had been created through it. And that, she realized, was the greatest miracle of all. For most of her life, Ava had been someone who believed in the power of hard work and determination. She had always prided herself on being independent, on solving her own problems, and making things happen. But as the years went by, she found herself facing obstacles that seemed impossible to overcome. No matter how much effort she put in, the results were always just out of reach. Ava struggled with the feeling of being stuck, as if she was giving everything she had, only to see her dreams slip further away. She prayed, she worked, she hoped, but no matter how hard she tried, things didn't seem to improve. One of the hardest times in her life came when she lost her job. It wasn't just the financial burden, but the emotional weight that came with it. Ava had invested so much of herself in her work, believing it would be the foundation for her future. When the company she worked for folded, it felt as though all the plans she had made were suddenly shattered. She didn't know what to do or where to turn. She had never felt so lost in her life. Her faith wavered, and her trust in God's plan began to falter. It was during this low point, sitting alone in her living room with tears in her eyes, that Ava remembered something her grandmother had told her many years ago. Trust God even when the path is unclear, Ava. His plans are greater than anything you can imagine. Just keep walking in faith. Those words echoed in her mind like a gentle whisper, reminding her that God's timing was not always the same as hers, and his plans were always bigger than what she could see. But in that moment, Ava struggled to believe it. How could she trust when everything felt so uncertain? The days that followed were filled with frustration. Ava felt like she was caught in an endless cycle of disappointment. But despite the heaviness in her heart, there was something in her soul that refused to give up. A small flicker of hope remained, like a candle burning in the darkness. She wasn't sure how or when, but Ava felt that she needed to keep going, to keep praying, even when she didn't feel the answers. As she spent more time in prayer, Ava started to feel a shift in her heart. She realized that trust wasn't about knowing all the details or understanding how everything would work out. Trust was about surrendering her fears and doubts and believing that God was working in her life, even when she couldn't see it. It was about holding on to the belief that her prayers and acts of faith, no matter how small, were contributing to something greater. Ava began to focus less on the things she couldn't control and more on what she could do. She took small steps each day, finding new ways to support herself and rebuild her confidence. She reached out to old friends, sought guidance, and began to invest in herself in ways she hadn't done in years. Slowly, she started to notice the little miracles happening around her unexpected opportunities. Kind words from strangers, doors that were opening when she least expected them. They weren't grand gestures, but there were signs that something bigger was unfolding. In the weeks that followed, Ava's sense of peace grew. She no longer felt the urgency to control everything. She had learned that her journey wasn't about rushing toward the end result, but about trusting God in the process. Each day was a small act of faith, a quiet belief that her prayers were heard and that God was working behind the scenes. The path wasn't always clear, but Ava no longer felt the need to understand everything. She simply trusted that God's plan would unfold in its own time. A few months later, Ava received a job offer from a company that aligned perfectly with her skills and values. It wasn't the path she had originally envisioned, but it felt like a beautiful confirmation that God had been guiding her all along. The job wasn't just a career opportunity, it was a chance for her to grow, to contribute in new ways, and to continue walking in faith. It was a reminder that every step, every prayer, every moment of doubt had been leading her to this point. As Ava stood on the threshold of this new opportunity, she reflected on the journey she had taken. She saw how her struggles had been part of a bigger picture, how her prayers and acts of faith had been woven into a tapestry of divine purpose. She understood now that God had never abandoned her even when she couldn't see his hand at work. His plans were greater than she could have ever imagined, and her trust in him had led her to a place of fulfillment she had once thought impossible. The road ahead wasn't perfect, and Ava knew there would still be challenges, but she also knew that she had learned to trust in God's timing and his plan for her life. She had learned that faith wasn't about knowing the answers or seeing the full picture. It was about trusting that even in the silence, God was always working. She had discovered that every prayer and every step of faith, no matter how small, contributed to miracles unfolding in her life. She no longer feared the unknown. With unwavering faith, Ava walked forward, knowing that the best was yet to come. As she looked back on the months of uncertainty and struggle, Ava could see the hand of God at work in ways she hadn't understood at the time. The broken pieces of her life had come together, and she was now walking in a future far greater than she could have imagined. She smiled, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, God was with her, guiding her every step of the way. All she had to do was trust, and he would lead her to exactly where she needed to be. As Ava stood at the window, gazing out at the setting sun, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had come so far from the uncertainty and fear that once consumed her. The path she had walked wasn't the one she had planned, but it was the one she was meant to walk. Every moment of doubt, every tear, and every prayer had led her to this moment of understanding. She had learned that trust in God wasn't about seeing the whole picture, it was about believing in the journey, even when the road was unclear. Ava smiled softly, knowing that life would always have its challenges, but she was no longer afraid of the unknown. Her faith had carried her through the hardest of times, and she had come to realize that God's plan was far greater than she could ever imagine. What she once saw as obstacles were now stepping stones, each one bringing her closer to the person she was meant to be. In the quiet of her heart, she whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for the blessings she had received, but for the strength and faith that had sustained her. With every step forward, she knew she was never alone. God's love was her constant companion, guiding her, teaching her, and leading her to a future filled with hope and purpose. Ava had found her peace, and in that peace, she knew that the best was yet to come.